what extent did American subjective views of Mexicans, created by NAFTA, influence the wave of Mexican migrant workers into America and their acceptance within society?
What is NAFTA? NAFTA stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement. It is a trade pact signed by the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, which made it easier for companies in those three countries to move goods and supplies across the North American border. The agreement took effect on January 1st, 1994, and essentially eliminated tariffs on most goods traded among these three nations. Despite all of the benefits that NAFTA was supposed to bring about, not all of the effects of NAFTA were good. Here are some cons. One of the greatest cons of NAFTA was there was a loss of jobs in both the United States and Mexico. This forced jobless Mexicans to cross the border illegally. Data suggests that as more American goods were introduced into the Mexican market, American produce was typically favored and purchased over Mexican produce. The reason why American produces were more favored over Mexican produces was because American produces were cheaper, and they were cheaper because they had cheaper means of producing their goods. Jobs were lost in America as well, but only a small minority of Americans who lived in manufacturing-based towns in the South were primarily affected. These Southern workers created subjective views of Mexicans due to their anger of losing their jobs and their economical decay manufacturing and agricultural towns. They made it seem as if NAFTA was more bad than good in America, even though most Americans are benefiting from it. And it created fear throughout all of America that Mexicans were going to take all the jobs. Prior to the creation of NAFTA, Americans already had racial subjective views towards Mexicans. Americans viewed them as poor, uneducated, violent, unethical, and thought to bring corruption because of crime. People applied anti-immigration and American patriotism. But after NAFTA took effect, many Americans used NAFTA as propagating that Mexicans were a danger to America, not only when it comes to the loss of jobs, but also because they bring crime and gang-affiliated conflict. This led to NAFTA becoming more unfair as these upset manufacturing laborers and farmers in America pushed the government to put higher tariffs on Mexican goods, thus abandoning the original NAFTA treaty promises and plans. Mexican farmers were out of business. This caused a push for Mexican migrant workers to be forced to come to America illegally to make a living. This added on to the subjective views that Americans have created, even though the jobs the Mexican migrant workers were taking were undesirable jobs in America.
These people are taking our jobs. You know what? That's a myth, Charlie. That really is a myth. Because the reality today is that nobody wants to work in agriculture any longer. It's not an American job any longer. We did a campaign a few years ago, 3 years ago, and we invited people to say, we called the campaign, Take Our Jobs. People were calling us up, and they were asking, well, is there a limousine that's going to come pick me up for work? Is there air conditioning in the fields, Charlie? I mean, those are the kinds of things that they were asking.
Now let's revisit our topic question. To what extent did American subjective views of Mexicans, created by NAFTA, influence the wave of Mexican migrant workers into America and their acceptance into society? Our answer to the question is that NAFTA influenced the increase of anti-immigration beliefs in American society and created a more patriotic mentality that caused Americans to focus more on the harm that NAFTA was causing to them rather than the harm that it was causing to everyone as a whole.
First, let's address the patriotic beliefs that had risen as a result of NAFTA. This quote emphasizes how patriotic Americans have become. On page 168 of Fresh with Broken Body, it states, when I asked a neighbor of the migrant camp in which I lived in the Singit Valley named Phil, what he thought of his migrant labor neighbors, he replied, "I lost my job because of them." He explained that he had worked for a local white farmer for over 10 years, but was replaced because that farmer could hire 2 migrant workers for what he was being paid. His mother then reminded him that he hated his job. Phil agreed. Interestingly, he blamed the Mexican migrants and excused the farmer who actually made the hiring decision, and kept silent about the pressures from the international market. Regarding the farmer, Phil simply stated, "I understand where he's coming from. He wants to run his farm efficiently." This quote displays American patriotic belief because Phil is blaming the migrant worker because he feels like the migrant worker is not a citizen of the United States and thus does not deserve to benefit from the American economy due to his lack of personhood and identity. The lack of personhood of these migrant workers can be seen in the fact that these migrant workers were not considered as refugees, but rather as the enemy. This can be seen on page 188 when it states, "In addition, there are consistencies in the dichotomies commonly employed in immigration studies: refugee versus migrant, political versus economic, forced versus voluntary. The terms refugee, political migrant, and forced migrant are related. In order for one to be considered a refugee and receive asylum privileges in the United States, one must prove, among other things, that he or she was forced to migrate for a political reason." Thus, the opposing terms and the dichotomies above function as characteristics justifying exclusion from legal refugee status and the economic and political rights it brings. This common ideology can be seen in the fact that Americans feel like the loss of jobs in America are caused by Mexicans taking them selfishly rather than the truth, that they are forced to come to America and take jobs because of NAFTA and its inequalities. Justification for not addressing the suffering of Mexicans caused by NAFTA came from subjective views that Americans created about Mexican identities, which lowered their personhoods within society. These subjective views and changes in lowering of personhood were created by racial insensitivity of the American people caused by patriotism that was sparked up by NAFTA. NAFTA influenced a rise in patriotism because Americans felt as if NAFTA was harming the American society, and they blamed this harming of the American society on Mexicans. While fixing NAFTA, Americans disregarded figuring out how they could fix NAFTA for all the countries involved. Instead, they focused on how they could fix NAFTA for Americans, and this caused additional harm to the Mexican economy. Harm that was caused to the Mexican economy was easily disregarded because of subjective views that Americans had about immigration that were kind of sparked up by the ramifications of NAFTA. This is described as naturalization. On page 182 of Frederick Broken Bodies, it states that naturalization occurred via the racialization of bodies and the perception that certain categories of ethnic bodies belonged in certain occupational positions. This normalization of social inequalities occurred through the hiddenness of certain classes of bodies as well as through the subtle meanings of bodily positions. So the naturalization of the position of Mexicans within society created an acceptance of the ramifications of NAFTA on Mexico and prevented Americans from addressing these problems efficiently. Last, on page 171, it states perceptions of bodily difference along ethno-racial lines serve as lenses through which symbolic violence is enacted, such that each state category of body is understood to deserve its relative social position because of what is considered their natural characteristics. This furthermore forced more migrant workers to have to immigrate into America in order to find jobs. Indigenous African bodies are understood to belong to picking berries as opposed to other jobs. On the other hand, other ethnicities have bodies that do not fit well in the picker category. Last, on page 169, it states, second, many people justify the living conditions of migrant workers based on what they assume is normal for them. In conclusion, this shows that NAFTA helped to justify the subjectification of Mexican migrant workers, thus normalizing their suffering. Thank you.